Thank you so much for joining us. We do invite everyone who can to turn on their camera. It is always nicer to see the faces of colleagues and friends and students when we can. My name is Daniela Bleichmer. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities. And thank you so much for joining us today for a book chat about Diane Winston's brand new book, Writing the American Dream: How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2023. Joining us today to discuss the book with Diane are Darren Dochuk, who is Andrew V. Take's College Professor of History, and William W. and Anna Jean Koshua, co-director of the Koshua Center for the Study of American Catholicism at Notre Dame University. Also joining us is Lerone A. Martin, the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in Religious Studies and Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. And the conversation will be moderated by Kamy Akhavan, the Executive Director of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. We will start with a very brief introduction to the project by the author, by Diane, who will tell us about it. And then Professors Dochuk and Martin will engage her in conversation about the book for roughly half an hour. And after that, we will open it up to questions from anyone present, moderated by Kamy. So Diane, thank you so much. Congratulations on your new book. And please tell us about it, for which we will need you to unmute.
Thank you, Daniela. And thank you all for being with us today. And special thank you to Kamy, Darren, and Lerone for helping me out. If you're like me, you look at the paper every morning and you wonder, how did we get here? I'm speaking specifically about the political crisis from my perspective that we all are facing. And that crisis is about our democracy, it's about our leadership, but it's also about our ideological commitments and how we came to be here. What I've done in this book is try to explain all the backstory that has led us to the present moment. And in my telling, the backstory has a lot to do with two factors that social histories don't usually consider. One is religion, and the other is the news media. I try to think expansively about embedding news and religion into the larger narrative of American politics. And I call this book slow reading, borrowing the term from slow cooking. In other words, it's something that it's not a fast-moving plot. The characters are pretty fascinating. And the general idea is to steep readers in the cultural fabric of the 1980s so that what happened in terms of the changing political landscape and our changing political ideology is understandable through the history of the time. I wrote this book began this book in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president, because I thought we were on the verge of a turning point in our political history. I thought that the Reagan years and the market logics, which had so dominated our country, were going to change into something more humane and humanistic. Unfortunately, I was wrong. And instead of helping us birth a new way of looking at ourselves as a nation and as citizens, we fell into Trump land, which I think has led us to what I call apocalyptic nihilism. The idea that the end is coming for all of us, so we might as well throw our hands up and do whatever the hell we want in the meantime. I hope that that's not going to be the case when we go to the polls this year. And I hope that by some magic, we can find a new leader who can do what Reagan did in the 1980s, which is basically use his pulpit to help us think of a new way of understanding our position as Americans, both in the world and in our society and in our responsibilities to each other. The book basically looks at history of religion and media, which is something that's not normally thought about, but I posit that there is a longstanding relationship between the media and religion. And it looks at the circumstances of the 1980s and especially how the baby boomers contributed to this changing political and religious landscape. I argue that there were certain important narratives in 1983, which was a pivotal year for the Reagan presidency. It was do or die. He came into 1983 with a very low ranking, and it looked like he would not be reelected. And somehow he managed by December of 1983 to be hailed as America's white knight. How that happened and the narrative said he used through the media to get to that point are the topic and subject of the book. So that's sort of a short explanation for what the book is about, why I wrote it, and why I think it's important. And I'd love to hear from Darren and Lerone, and then from the rest of you.
Thank you. I'll start. Thanks, Diane, for that brief summary. There's so much that is rich and textured in this book, so impossible to cover it all, certainly in an hour that we have. Very impressive book and important. I could, again, elaborate on what I see some of the major interventions here. I'll just, at this point, highlight the role that the book plays in highlighting mainline media. We have a number of books that have been written recently on the rise of conservative media, as if they are kind of part of an infrastructure that was isolated or set apart. The brilliance of this book is really to show how mainstream media itself, contrary to complaints of it leaning liberal, actually facilitated the rise of the Reagan religious imaginary and the political effects of which we're still living with today. So thank you for adding that, again, that texture and that complexity to a historiography of politics and journalism and media and religion that is continuing to evolve here. I hesitate to do this. I have, so many questions, and they're, I'll emphasize from the beginning, their curiosities. Some lean to the, well, what about, or what if you added this? And I always feel bad about asking those types of questions, but it's because the book just generated so many of those types of curiosities. One is the most basic and predictable, and that just comes back to Ronald Reagan himself. I mean, what is it, having spent time in the Reagan archives, getting to know his work as a politician? This is someone who wrote speeches, who wrote letters to fans and to constituents, very much engaged in the political process. And that's the sense you get from this book. This is someone who, yes, was part of a system. His speeches were carefully written by his assistants. At the same time, he was very much kind of shaping this new political landscape. So, Dan, just a simple open-ended question for you to reflect a bit more on how Ronald Reagan, the biography of this man, sheds new light on the role of media circa 1983. Were there any surprises for you as you dug into the presidency of Reagan and found him not to be a passive actor, but very much engaged in creating and selling this religious imaginary for political purposes?
Thanks, Darren. That's a great question. I, like many reporters in the 1980s, thought that Reagan really was pretending to be a Christian, and he was using it for his own purposes of organizing conservative voters. One of the things that really surprised me as I delve deeper into his biography was that he was in fact a committed Christian, and he did have a long history of involvement with the church, so much so that at his home church, many thought he would go into the ministry and were surprised when he instead went into first entertainment and then the movies. So Reagan's personal religiosity was surprising to me because of course, he used it as a political tool, but I think it was motivated not by opportunism so much as true conviction. I also was struck by the fact that Reagan had an intuitive sense of what I call the religious imaginary. I don't think if we asked Reagan today if he was trying to change the country's religious imaginary, he would have known how to answer. He probably would have laughed and said, "What do you mean, honey?" So I think that he was one of those very skilled politicians who understood what the nation needed and where it had to go. I think we all consider the Reagan Revolution to be about the economy. But what I argue is the economy is the tip of what he did, because it is buoyed by these religious convictions he had about the economy. He wanted to lower taxes because he wanted to get rid of welfare. During his governorship, when he was governor in California, he repeatedly said that welfare is the #1 problem in the nation, and the only way to get rid of it is to lower taxes. So I guess that reinforces what I initially said about his religiosity, insofar as the political stances which he is most known for, i.e. his fight against communism and his changing of the budget, his reducing taxes, were actually motivated by his religious principles.
I'll jump in now, and thank you for that wonderful, wonderful response, because I too came away with a different understanding of Reagan from reading this book. And one of the things that I think is a mark of a great book is something that takes a topic that you think you know and forces you to look at it completely differently. So I want to thank you for that. I have a question, and you'll have to forgive me. It's about something that's not in the book, but I'm doing it for selfish reasons because I really want to know what you think, because you've helped me rethink Reagan in so many different ways. So you do an amazing job of pointing out what you call the religious imaginary, right? And I love that you say this involves economic ideas, social values, and political practices that go beyond kind of just going to church, right? This is a lived religion. I love the way you point that out. So I would love for you to expound upon and selfishly help me figure something out. And that is, in 1983, in addition to the events you point out, the huge events, Grenada, Evil Empire speech, attack on welfare, Reagan also signs into law the MLK holiday. And this is a moment, right, where I think your religious imaginary really helped me, in that you had someone who was opposed to the MLK holiday. And then eventually, as it gets pushed through Congress in '83, he decides to immediately sign it. He has Coretta at the White House. It's the news media covers it. So help me understand how this religious imaginary, which is completely opposite, as you point out in the book, to the religious imaginary of Martin King. So how does Reagan's, I'm going to say, diabolical brilliance incorporate MLK's religious imaginary into his own in 1983?
That is a great question, because one of the points I make in the book is how Reagan and his team maliciously racialized poverty. And I do think that reflects his understanding and his thinking of the time, and it certainly doesn't fit in with going along with an MLK Day. That said, Reagan was a very savvy politician. He kicked off the 1980 campaign at the Neshoba State Fair, right near the place where 3 civil rights leaders were murdered. He quickly followed that up by going up north into Black communities and disavowing any notion that he'd gone to Neshoba with any intention other than just, oh, it's a nice place to be. And I think that speaks to Reagan's political pragmatism. He understood that most people of color probably were not going to support him, but he also realized he wasn't going to give up on them either. And the MLK Day was almost a fait accompli by the time it came to him. And so I think that he realized he would be a better statesman and politician by graciously accepting its reality and by inviting Coretta and other luminaries to the White House. So I don't think it fit into his religious imaginary at all. I think it fit into his statesmanship.
Okay.
But do you have a different idea? Do you have a different idea about that?
Well, no, I actually think that I came away reading your book thinking that his this fits his religious imaginary in that he's able to, as you pointed out, brilliantly incorporate Martin King into that, even though this narrative you speak of, right? Even though we know King stands against it, he's able to just tell a different kind of story, right? That racism's over. And if you just are a good American and have this rugged individualism, we can all move into Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, right? The only thing that's stopping us is big government and people who are relying on big government. You should rely on yourself. I mean, so I came away reading this book thinking like, that maybe this is not diabolical. Maybe this is actually Reagan really might believe this, that maybe he actually believes this. I mean, it doesn't change the fact for me he's still wrong as 2 left feet, but it changed the way that I thought about it, and your book helped me do that. So thank you.
All right, well, let's, I guess, continuing on the theme, Reagan, eclectic, again, perhaps that's why difficult to pin down necessarily, and why journalists and scholars alike have had a hard time pinning him down. What was obviously smart about his politics and his religious imaginary was its ecumenism as well, eclectic and ecumenical. So this is a story rightly about evangelicals and Reagan's embrace of the evangelical religious imaginary. But it's also about neoconservatism, neoliberalism. I mean, this is a story that extends beyond evangelicals per se. So again, just to nudge and to ask you to think beyond evangelical circles, how this religious imaginary is constructed, and as a broad canopy of ecumenism, much in the same way Eisenhower's was, right? This is a kind of a Judeo-Christian mythology that Reagan embraces, that certainly gains traction through the particularities of evangelicalism, but it's also broad enough to include others. So the role of Jewish intellectuals, for instance, of course, is well known in the rise of neoconservatism. Catholic media presence, and the ways in which these other religious groups, LDS, contribute to the Reagan Revolution through an endorsement of this religious imaginary. And then I guess I would just add quickly, finally, and I don't know if it directly ties into what I'm asking, but can we say Reagan is responsible for shifting this Judeo-Christian mythology from a broad liberal mainstream to the right? Healing Gaston has written I think, a really important book on how what once was a tri-faith America promoted by Eisenhower in the 50s is co-opted by conservatives by the 1980s and becomes a notion of the nation that is very kind of right-leaning. And it seems to me that Reagan is absolutely pivotal in making that shift. So again, open-ended, Diane, but whatever you can offer would be appreciated.
Yeah, I think that Falwell actually was instrumental in that broadening the conservative base. I think he quickly realized that if he was going to truly be a moral majority, he needed Jews, Muslims, and Catholics to go along with him. I believe that he started organizing in 78, which predates Reagan's presidency. So perhaps both men were working in different spheres. Falwell actually with religious communities, and Reagan as a politician, bringing them together. This was a real advance for conservative politics, and I think it made possible what we see today with Trump. The fact that it's hard for us to remember now how evangelicals were so anti-Catholic, anti-Mormon, and even anti-Semitic back in the 70s and 80s, because now the conservative religious right seems more monolithic and more joined together. I think Reagan was able to use the support of men like William Buckley and Baruti and William Baruti and others to move successfully within Catholic conservative circles. And of course, neolibs embraced him because of his strong policy against the Soviet Union. So yes, I think Reagan was able to make this religious imaginary broad enough so religious folks of different backgrounds would be able to find buy-in. But I find what's even more amazing is that he was able to reach people who were not religious or who were religious but not conservative and bring them into the tent also. And I think he did that by using language which could be heard in different registers. And at times, a message which might seem very straightforward to an evangelical audience was not the same way for a secular one. Secular people heard, we're going to make the country great again. I'm going to reduce your taxes. You know, people need to be responsible for themselves. They didn't necessarily hear the religious imaginary that was fueling it. Is that what you were asking about?
No, for sure. Thank you. Yes.
I'll follow up with a question about our current moment, in that you conclude the text by talking about a bit about Trump, and you point out some distinctions about Reagan and Trump, that you don't see Trump as really having these sort of sincere religious commitments. Don't see him as having any types of commitment to the country. It's much more about ego and self, whereas you see, Reagan was, sincere, that he thought welfare, for example, was bad for the country. And you also point out, which is another wonderful argument, about the difference in the media landscape, right? That we can't count on a unified kind of consensus voice, right? Media is now much more splintered. You could call it democratized, but it's not as unified. I would love to hear you just talk a little bit about, do you see any similarities between the two, or between Reagan and Trump, despite the difference in historical moment? Do you see any similarities? Because you opened up by telling us that you kind of have this hope that something is going to emerge in our political future where someone's going to be able to do what Reagan did. So I'm just curious, do you see any similarities between Reagan and Trump? And then question B would be, if not, do you see anything else on the horizon? And I'm just asking for a friend who's looking for hope.
Well, the things that have propelled both Reagan and Trump to such heights are their similarities as communicators. And I say in the book that Reagan had this background as a radio broadcaster and as an actor, and Trump has a background as a provocateur and also a television personality. So both of them obviously know how to speak to people in very clear language. They also, despite their own personal wealth, had a great appeal to the common person. And so even though both of them live very large in their personal lives, regular everyday people seem to think they were both one of them. You know, I was not a Reagan supporter. I have deep problems with Reagan's politics. I think he put the country on a terrible path. But I have to say, Reagan had strong, sincere convictions, and he wanted what he felt was best for the country, and he believed in democracy. So even though I thoroughly disagree with him, I think he did horrible things. I think his legacy is terrible. I think he tried to do what he believed was right. I think Trump has no guiding morality or ethical vision. He's totally about himself, and he's totally about accruing power, influence, and money. And that is a tremendous difference between the two men, which makes me at least somewhat, I don't want to say sympathetic to Reagan, but at least I can't say I hate him with the same degree of passion that I feel for Trump. And if someone is a Trump supporter, I'm sorry, these are my feelings. I think Reagan would be appalled to see where the country is today. And I wonder if he would recognize the fact that he sowed the seeds for this in his emphasis on individual responsibility and individualism and market logics, because Trump is a perfect creation of that. He takes it to such a malignant level that it's almost unrecognizable. And yet this idea of, we are each responsible to God in our own way, and God promises us freedom, taken to its nth degree, is where you get Trump. And this American idea that anything I as an individual do is right, and I have, no responsibility to anyone but myself.
I
Believe it or
agree.
not,
Oh,
I'm sorry, Lerone, I was going to say, believe it or not, we are just over the halfway point for today's discussion. And I think what that means is we've got time for one more question piece from Darren and from Lerone, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. And the format for audience questions, there's a feature in Zoom that says reactions, a little smiley face. If you click on that, there's a raise hand feature. And if you do want to ask a question, then use the raise hand feature, and we'll call on you and you can unmute and ask your question. But so far, this is fascinating. Moving this quickly. Lerone, I see you want to follow up, and then we'll go back to Darren.
yeah, so let me just follow up really quickly and say, so given the dispersed media landscape you point out at the end of the book, is it possible for us to even expect someone to do what you said Reagan was able to do, but leverage it in a way that is more welcoming and inclusive as it relates to citizenship, the responsibility of government, and so forth and so on? Is that even possible?
That is the question, isn't it? On the one hand, I say we do have a very diverse and fragmented media, and yet certain things come through across. Donald Trump has managed to be central to both the mainstream media and to siloed conservative and religious media. So it's possible that the right person could code switch between the two. It's also possible that someone could rise up not from the political sphere, but from a sector that reaches both sides. I'm more and more wishing I had been a screenwriter instead of a journalist in the early part of my career, because whereas people know what journalism they do or do not want to read, everybody goes to the movies. So if, for instance, Marvel movies had the correct savior person who also decided to become a politician, that person could speak to all sides. I mean, you're laughing. I just came back from India, where there's an increasing number of
Yes.
actors who are becoming politicians, and
Yes.
they have built-in audiences. They have, policies that are much more progressive. They oppose Modi. And so it's possible that we need to look in different arenas to find a person who can speak to everybody.
Absolutely. Darren, let me just say one more thing. I'm sorry, Darren. And I also came away from this thinking the point Darren made earlier about the role of mainstream media playing the role in Reagan's America. I also left this book feeling like the mainstream media or liberal media today, right? That the book will also be written to point out the role that, for example, MSNBC and CNN have played in Trump's America, in the sense of the constant free airtime. And I'll end with this, and I think I shared this with you before, Diane. The quote from Les Moonves when he was running CBS News sticks with me, right? That Trump is bad for America, but he's great for ratings. So I came away from this book, as you point out, what future historians and researchers will write. I came away thinking they'll have to consult you and the thesis that you claim for the 80s, but will probably also be true for Trump's America. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I read the Post and the Times and all other papers, and I am shocked on the one hand that they give so much uncritical space to Trump. And yet I remember that this is corporate media and it needs to get eyeballs and clicks and ears and all the rest of the stuff. And if Trump is reelected, I'm going to put a lot of that on the mainstream media, who, after Biden was elected, promised never to do again what they did in 2016. And now we're doing the whole thing over again. So yes, in many ways, I am pretty disgusted by mainstream media, even quote unquote liberal media, because I don't think they have truly thought out what their responsibility is in the political arena, which is maddening.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, great conversation there. And I don't want to extend this too much. I know we'll probably have questions here. I was going to ask about the Jimmy Carter religious imaginary and why that didn't stick. But I also just want to give you a chance, Diane, to tell us a bit about the process of writing this book itself. So often, and rightly so here, this is a book that is full of important arguments and ideas, and but it's also just beautifully written. No surprise coming from your pen. But you made some decisions that I think were really effective. Your focus on years as flashpoints, 1973, but especially 1983. Your decision to focus on print media as opposed to some of the other forms. What were some of the challenges along the way, or how did you come to make these decisions? Did these raise challenges of another sort for you as a writer?
That's such a nice question. Thank you, Darren. I do want to quickly say that if Carter's religious imaginary had caught on, we'd be a very different country today. And it says something about the American public that when he tried to counsel sober self-reflection, it was perceived as malaise. It was anything but malaise. So to the extent that the American public tends to be lazy in its own thinking, And if that was true in 1976 to 1980, how much more true is it today with the disintegration of our educational system? I can't imagine a leader like Carter. And again, Carter was far from perfect. He was not a great communicator, but he did try to put Americans in a position where they could realistically think about the future and think about it wisely, which is not something they wanted to do. They just wanted to make America great again. So as far as writing the book, as I said, I started the book in 2008, and it was a very different book that I thought I was writing. And in the process of doing the research, and I'm sure this has happened to all of you who are scholars and who write books, you find your ideas changing about what you can do and how best you can do it. It was, I tried to make decisions that would narratively support what I wanted to do. And I thought that focusing on 1 year would make sense for that reason, because I could tell the story. And 1983 was a great year to do it, since it was the year, make or break year for Reagan. I looked for examples that were dramatic enough that they could hold readers' attention. What strikes me most as I talk about the book at various venues, practically no one today knows what happened in Grenada. That seems to have, dropped from consciousness. And I don't think most people understand that story of, as I said earlier, racializing and gendering welfare. Most people, don't think about that too much. So I thought it was important to raise up some of those stories. The hardest thing for me about writing the book was realizing that I needed to steep myself in political history, media studies, and journalism. And it took a long time to master those different fields. I tried to put some journalistic analysis into every chapter for readers who aren't journalists, so they can understand the process of journalism better. I tried to add some religious explanations for people who aren't religionists who come to this. So in order to make sure everyone could keep going with the argument, I had to do a lot of integrating and understanding myself, and you can't explain something until you get inside of it. So that's the reason the book took like 12 years to write. But every time I read it, I feel good about it, because I think that it speaks to the power of the media in this country, which is something we all know, but we may not see how it works. It speaks to the importance of religion, which I think is totally underrepresented category in news and entertainment media. And it speaks to how both of those contribute to our polity and to the way we look at ourselves as citizens in this country. And so I think the triangulation of all three was both the hardest decision I made, but also the best. But I'd like to write about one thing with one narrative next.
We are at 12:43. I think, Lerone, you have the right for one more question here. Then we're going to switch over to George. And George, I'll call on you to unmute and ask your question in just a second here. And I just want to note too that here we are advised talk about religion and politics, and here we're doing both together. And how fun is that? So Lerone, to you for the final interlocutor question. Then we're going to pivot to George.
I no question, just say, Diane, thank you again for a wonderful book. Thank you for engaging those three historiographies, and you did it beautifully. So thank you. And I'm happy to cede my time, as they would say in the House of Representatives.
Thanks, Lerone.
George, you've been patiently holding up that hand, my friend. So I'm eager to hear your question.
Well, thank you very much. And hi, Diane. Good to
Hey,
see you.
George.
Thanks so much for your book. We look forward to having you in Dallas in the fall. For those of you who don't know, I live in Dallas, and I am a minister and was here during the years that Diane was a religion reporter here in Dallas. And I guess part of the frustration, Diane, I have is that why there are not more Diane Winstons in the media, which is to say, you chronicle this incredibly important connection between religion and politics, and we see that this has only grown. That now what we have is someone like Mike Johnson, who's Speaker of the House, who believes that he is a new Moses and anointed by God. And we've just been through a Trump presidency with Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence, who have Christian Zionist views, where all of these folks are in positions of power, but their politics are also being fueled by a religious vision of the end of the world, an apocalyptic vision, in fact, which rather than doing politics as a way of improving the world, there is a weird sense in which if the world gets worse by virtue of their policies, it hastens the day of Jesus' return. And I guess my question is why we don't have in the media people contesting the underlying religious convictions of these politicians that are leading us in catastrophic ways right now. It's almost as if religion gets a pass, that it's viewed as being personal convictions, but in fact, it is driving policy in this country as well. And it doesn't seem that we have people in the media who understand the religious dimensions of what these politicians are doing enough to challenge and contest the veracity of them in a sense and hold them accountable in the way we would in other sense. So I'd like you to kind of talk about why we haven't made greater progress in religiously informed journalism in addressing these challenges.
Thank you, George, for that question. I'm not sure I fully agree with you because I think journalists like Jeff Charlotte, Emma Green, some folks at The Atlantic have tried to hold up a mirror to what's going on. And unfortunately, maybe it's we, the audience, who aren't getting it or doing much about it. It's true that more people are interested in writing about sports or, political horse races than they are looking sensitively about the relationship between religion and politics. But those who do it, I think, do a fairly good job. Another problem might be that many of the people I'm talking about write for publications, whether it's Jeff in GQ or Emma in the New Yorker, that maybe aren't seen by a lot of people. And maybe the problem is on the level of local news and even regional news. We don't have people doing that. I think that speaks probably to the crisis in journalism as much as it does to the fact that there aren't people doing it. As you well know from, seeing what's happening in Dallas, papers are shrinking, news holes are shrinking, television's doing things quicker and shorter. NPR is trying to tread a line so it can keep being funded. So there aren't that many places where young journalists might be able to really go deeply into this topic and write about it. I mean, gee, I would love to be, in some ways, I'd love to be a reporter in Texas or Alabama because you could get deeply into religion and politics. But would my editor want to give me the time? Would an editor want to give me the space? Would we be alienating too many readers? I mean, I think that it's not a question of people not being there. It's a question of the system not supporting it. And that is the crisis of journalism today. Sorry to be on a soapbox.
That's okay. Thank you.
Great question. I feel like we have another great question and response coming soon. This one courtesy of Dave Newman. Dave, what's your question?
I have a kind of related question, and this can be centered in Reagan in the 1983 moment that this chapter talks about, but it's really about the way in which evangelicalism comes to be seen as America's normative religion. And I understand from the sort of supply side how that comes about. But in thinking about the role of the media, why weren't journalists more effective in contesting the notion that American religion is inherently evangelicalism? So just to take the notion of a massive military buildup as opposed to nuclear freeze, or a more compassionate response towards AIDS as opposed to the idea that this is God's judgment. Clearly, mainline Christians were outspoken, and some Catholics were outspoken in taking different stances, but that doesn't seem to be what came to be seen as the sort of normative American religious view. Like the evangelical voice comes to be the definitive voice in this conversation, it seems. So what role does the media play in allowing that version to stand?
Well, at the risk of alienating my boss, who is part of this conversation, I think that is a problem with a structural problem with the media that we see now also, which is people seem to gravitate to extremes. In 1980s, Falwell had an extreme voice, and he was seemed particularly weird to reporters coming from big papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And he seemed like someone who would be good to quote because he would rile people up. They'd want to hear more of these weird and crazy ideas. And for that reason, he was, we'd say, clickbait now, but he, gave good soundbite, as we would say then. I also think that many newspapers and television stations have considered religion to be a special case. Most journalists tend not to be religious. They tend to be more secular, and they oftentimes don't understand religion and don't necessarily want to try. So someone who says they're a fundamentalist or a conservative or orthodox in their religious feelings makes reporters think that these are the real interpreters of the faith. So a conservative like Jerry Falwell, who says, I believe in the Bible, has had more credibility than George Mason over there, because George wasn't pounding the table and saying his view was right. I mean, orthodoxy seemed more safe as a source than moderation, in other words. Mm-hmm. So it's partly really reporters don't know that much about religion. It was partly that that conservative religion seemed more like the real religion. And it was partly because many of those conservative religious figures learned how to talk to the media. So on many levels, and also I think that, people who are moderate were seen as vanilla. They weren't as interesting as people who seem to have crazy ideas to the elites who read newspapers.
Thank you for that response, Diane. I think in answering Dave's question, you addressed some of the questions that are appearing in the chat. And I want to share this suggestion from one of the listeners today. She's asking, is it possible to put some of the names of the journalists, the titles of the books in the chat? That may be helpful for the rest of us who want to kind of dig a little bit deeper. So if you have some to suggest, please drop them in the chat. And now I want to turn the line of questioning over to none other than Daniela, who has her hand raised. Daniela, what is your question?
I mean, it is a very ignorant and uninformed question. As Diane knows, I mostly spent my time in the 16th century, so this is a big stretch for me. But one of your comments, and something that you elaborate so helpfully in the book, is this idea of religion not considered a part of US politics. And my uninformed question is this not part of the myth of American exceptionalism, this idea that religion is important part of society, of politics for other people elsewhere, but not for us. One of the many myths of American exceptionalism that was shattered with the election of Trump, right? Those things happen elsewhere. Is that part of that blindness when in the 80s as today, the media is full of stories about the connection of politics and religion everywhere in the world. So why would there be this idea that this is not the case in the US?
I think it's partly a question of which America are you talking to, right? So for the America that I don't want to say it's just Southerners, but for the America that defines itself as religiously conservative, and I don't necessarily mean even politicized, but just religiously conservative, religion is and remains important. For many of those who are, I don't want to say elites, but who are secularists, you know, religion just doesn't factor into how they see the world. So I think there is a great discrepancy between those two camps of people, secularists who, and secularists isn't even correct because there are secularists who can say they appreciate the role of religion. I don't know what to call the many people I've met in my life who, you know, turn to me and say, why do you report on religion? Why do you write about religion? People, a lot of Americans just don't get it. And I'm always surprised when one of my colleagues, usually someone in history, comes up to me and says, gee, wow, religion really is important. And like, this is like late breaking news to them. So I think you're correct, Daniela, that, you know, religion has always been very woven into American politics. It's something that the founders gave a lot of thought to when they wrote the Constitution. And by that, I mean, they specifically did not want religion to be part of the Constitution. They gave enough thought to it to know what they didn't want. And it's been formative in most of our politics, whether we discuss it or not. I mean, one of the main arguments of the book is you cannot change a political ideology without having a religious dimension to it. Because if you had Reaganism without religion, it would be greed and self-interest. It would be, you know, the rapacious capitalists of the 1980s. And of today. The only way to make sense of market logics and to make it palatable is to code it in a religious framework that says God wants you to do this and this is fine. So why people don't get it, I don't know. It seems axiomatic to me.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left here, and I want to do a couple things. One is I want to thank George and Dave and Daniela for asking these questions. I want to thank Nina and Shirley and Mark for commenting in the chat. And I want to ask one quick question for Diane, and then I'll pivot back to Daniela. And Diane, the brief question for you is, we had Reince Priebus, former head of the Republican National Committee here on campus, maybe a couple of weeks ago. And to Lerone's point earlier, he said, conflict sells, unity loser. And I wonder if you can briefly talk about how Reagan was able to, on the one hand, sell conflict and be a uniter in the same person.
Yeah, that reminds me of a book I just read that people might be interested in. It's Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power and the Glory. Tim Alberta is a journalist who comes from an evangelical background, and he wanted to understand what happened to the church of his youth. And he goes and does a deep dive into the religious right and its creation. I recommend that. It's a very readable book, and it's an insider's perspective. And I'm thinking about that because in the book, he says Ralph Reed, the great strategist of the religious right, said there are two ways of motivating people, through fear and through hope. And most of the right today and Trump especially, uses fear. I think that speaks to your question, Kamy, because conflict like fear motivates people in ways that engages them and moves them forward. But unlike hope, it doesn't give them any room to grow or to think or to imagine new possibilities. So it's appealing to our bad angels as opposed to our good ones. And unfortunately, a lot of people make money off that. And a lot of politicians get votes.
Well said. And with that, I defer back to our host, Daniela. Thank you to Lerone, to Darren, and to Diane for this fascinating conversation. This is not the end of it, because we encourage everyone, if you haven't already done it, get your copy of Writing. It's available anywhere they sell books. Daniela, back to you.
Thank you so much. I was going to thank everybody who participated, but Kamy, you beat me to it. So thank you again to Darren, Dochuk, and Lerone, Martin. Thank you, Kamy, Akhavan, for moderating. Above all, thank you and many congratulations, Diane, for your book. It is both wonderful and depressing as it comes in this moment. But as a historian who cannot imagine anything more important than religion, I hope that in the long view, we will find a solution that you say you dream of. Thank you all for joining us as we celebrate Diane's publication. And I just want to mention super quickly, the Levan book chats, we do them to celebrate new publications by USC authors. Our next one is next week, also on the media. We will be discussing Karen Thompson's new book, Norm Porn, Queer Viewers and the TV That Soothes Us. So thank you. And again, congratulations to Diane. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.